Hello and welcome to the President's Podcast right here on the record with the Ohio Senate. The views the news excludes. I'm your host, John Fortney. I'm the Director of Communication for the Republican Caucus, the Majority Caucus in the Ohio Senate. Joining us this week, President Matt Huffman. Of course, it's called the President's Podcast. He's a Republican from Lima. And always great to have on the program State Senator Jerry Cirino, a Republican from Kirtland, Ohio, which is a suburb of Cleveland. Good to see you two.
Glad to be here.
Good to be here, John.
You know, right now we have this big multi-billion-dollar fund that we're preparing to pass this spring, later this spring, early summertime, called the capital budget. And on top of that is a one-time strategic community investment fund that our finance director likes to call the OTSCIF. So this is a lot of money, but we want to make sure that people understand that we're not just giving out money here, there, willy-nilly to anybody that wants it. There has to be a set of standards for that.
Yeah, John, so this is a process that typically happens in the even-numbered years. As folks know, constitutionally, we have to pass our operating budget by June 30th in the odd-numbered year. And so the capital budget, which is usually in the neighborhood of about $4 billion, is passed in that even-numbered year. And this consists of public works projects, school building projects, higher education. We also have what are called community projects, and these are largely legislator-directed funds. And those things all happen. And the amount of capital expenditures depends really on how much money the state has. So there was, in 2012, there wasn't much money. In 2010 also, and we didn't have community projects at all because there just wasn't the money to do that. Well, not only do we have money for capital projects, but we also have this larger fund, the $700 million. Now, you know, people say, well, it's a lot of money, so let's spend it. Well, if we're going to do that, we want it to be on things that are long-lasting, that matter. We want to do that with some sense of planning and intelligence in all of these sectors, of course, including the higher education.
And make sure that the money gets the results, that it's just not spent and then there's nothing to show for it. And that is one reason why, Senator Cirino, that you sent a letter to all the state university presidents saying, we would like to make sure that the projects that you're applying for, this money will be well spent. So we'd like you to show us the books based on what your administrative costs are like. Because we all know that tuition right now in Ohio is just not affordable to a lot of students.
Well, thanks, John. This relates to the capital budget. And we sent out, I sent out the letter to not only the university presidents, but also to the community college presidents. We have 23 of them. And although they're going to submit their information in writing from the community colleges. So the 14 presidents will be asked to come in and testify not only about their specific capital request, how it would be used, how it will impact student instruction, and so on, but also to answer other questions relative to their fiscal status and how they're spending money on programs. So we're going to ask questions about security for Jewish students because that's a very timely issue. It's an opportunity for them to share a lot of other information with us. And I think it's going to be, I know it's welcomed by the presidents. I've talked with many of them.
Well, that's good to know. It was not welcomed, however, by the Cleveland.com editorial board during one of their recent podcasts on January 31st. They spent about 7 minutes excoriating your letter. This was a direct quote, and I'm just going to quote from some of this from their podcast. The editor said, in referring to Senator Cirino, it's an intimidation. It's straight out intimidation. You want money from me? I'm going to grill you and put you in the hot seat. He's just out of control. I hear from people out in his district that are just shocked because he said he's a business guy and he's going to come in and bring a business sense to the legislature. Isn't that kind of what you're doing by doing this?
Yeah, it's actually, he's making my case for me that sure, asking for information about large expenditures, in this case, $400 million, and making sure that it's justifiable expenditures is quite exactly the way businesses run, or should run, certainly.
And I just want to say, John, typically in the past, this higher education fund, we haven't done an examination of it like this. And Jerry and I talked about this, and one of the principal problems that we have, that all universities have, is declining enrollment. We are past the baby echo, people aren't having as many children, yet universities, who the folks there want to survive and thrive and continue to build. We can't be building a brand new student center for a university if their enrollment is declining. Now, some of the universities' enrollment is going up and some of them gone down dramatically. But you don't simply just say, here's lots of money, we hope you do good things with it. That is not what the taxpayers want. That's not a legitimate legislative practice.
Nobody runs their household budget that way.
Sure, yeah, and so, obviously with Chairman Cirino and the folks, they've been working with university presidents for a few years, and this is, as Jerry mentioned, some of the presidents are saying, love to come in and tell you what we're doing at our university.
Well, that's good to know. I mean, they should open the books. It's called a public university for a reason.
Right. I mean, I've talked with probably 7 or 8 of the presidents, and nobody's complaining. They actually welcome the opportunity to come in and talk to the committee. I haven't heard one complaint from any of the others.
Well, the complaints seem to come. Of course, we know that Cleveland.com and the editorial board, they don't like either of you at all. They've called you the most
They don't like me?
No, they've called you the most sinister politician in Ohio in the
Sure,
last
they were
20
kidding.
years, right?
Yes.
And then they went on to say, the editor went on to say in this podcast, referring to Senator Cirino, this guy has declared war on colleges. He's trying to turn them into fascist training centers. No DEI, no free speech. We're going to train people to be conservatives. Do you have some hidden agenda to turn public universities into fascist training centers? That's
Senate Bill 83,
absurd.
if you look back at the legislative side of this, separate from the budget, is called the Higher Education Enhancement Act. And the purpose, in my motivation, is to make our universities better, make them more effective, making sure that we're teaching students how to learn, as opposed to what to learn and what to think. And look, the plain dealer and Cleveland.com, Chris Quinn likes to tell us how to do our jobs. I don't tell him how to run an irrelevant newspaper. So he has no business really telling us how we should do our job as legislators, or presume to know what I'm thinking or what the president's thinking about any particular policy issue.
One of the things, too, that there was a story that came out in 2021, and it was specifically addressing Ohio State University. In 2021, there were 132 DEI administrators at a cost of $13.4 million. And referring to the podcast from January 31st with Cleveland.com, he went on to say that the whole attack on free speech on college campuses, it is the opposite. What's next? Is he going to ask these folks if they go to church on Sunday? DEI has absolutely nothing to do with capital construction on campus, but administrative costs certainly do.
Well, right, and I, with that, I don't know, you probably have to house the 132 administrators someplace, so it has a little bit to do with capital, but, that's not what this examination is about. This specifically is about what are your capital costs, what are your requests, examining the expenditure of the public dollar. And the other part is we do deal with the operating costs, but the legislature, we're not on the ground telling the president and the board who run the university, not the faculty, not the employees, we're not telling them how to do that. Now, at some point, when we have so many complaints from the public about people being excluded from admissions to schools and being told how they have to think and what pronouns they have to use, I mean, these are Ohio citizens paying Ohio taxpayer dollars bringing us these complaints. And it's our job to deal with these public universities.
John, it's already been widely reported at Ohio State. It's actually $14 million and 145 people in their DEI department. You might say, well, out of a very, very large budget that all of Ohio State University has, that it's a very small amount. But if you ask parents or taxpayers, whether that's a significant amount of money, I think you'd have a different reaction to it. And Cleveland.com, again, doesn't understand the connection between fiscal responsibility and fiscal oversight that we are charged with, and how we're trying to impact higher education.
Don't ask anybody to go to church on Sunday either, apparently. One of the last comments that was said during the podcast It is pure ideology instead of the business of running a state. He has been an enormous disappointment as a legislator," in referring to you, Senator Cirino. Maybe the paper and the editorial board has been an enormous disappointment in running a newspaper.
Well, I think so. And if look at it this way, he said he's heard from my constituents in my district. I think that's probably very uncertain information, because I don't think very many actually read his paper or listen to his podcast.
But there's nothing wrong with taking a look at what the administrative costs are, because if you can run a public university, a K through 12 school system, public school system, or your own business, leaner and meaner, isn't that better?
Well, I think it's better, but more importantly, when it comes to taking dollars away from people in the form of taxes to pay for something, it's required. Now, I'm certainly not naive enough I understand that government is always going to be less efficient because they're spending somebody else's dollar. And by the way, government's not going out of business, no matter how bad a job we do. So it is important that, when the previous president brought on, the promise was 100 new diversity officers. And by the way, some of these people are getting paid $250,000 for these jobs. We're bringing on all these folks, and then within 3 months, then announced a $500 per quarter tuition increase. That's real money to the people who have to write these checks. So, with all government, by the nature of it, there are typically places where we can trim. Now, that's not true. There are some governments, and usually they're local governments, that are perform really efficiently, but in several billion dollar operation like a state university, there's places that you can control costs.
And this also gets back to the Public University Trustee Symposium that you both hosted at the Ohio State House in October. The message was that, listen, the trustees are the people that are really on the hook for a lot of the decision making. And that's why you also maybe want a president who is not afraid to tell the trustees something that they don't want to hear.
Well, in our approach to reform higher education in Ohio is a three-pronged approach. One is through legislation like 135 that we passed in the last GA, and 83, which will pass soon. We also are looking at using the budget process, as we've been talking about for the last few minutes here, to try to move the dial and change policy. But then we also have the trustees. And part of what we did in October when we had the trustees here was to make sure that they understood better what their governance role is, and that the presidents work for them, not the other way around. And I think a lot of policy, I've talked with trustees recently, and they're starting to really get it, and they're starting to move policy dial even without 83 becoming law just yet.
Of course, Youngstown State has a new president, former Ohio congressman in the Southeast Ohio area, 6th District, who is now the president at Youngstown State University. Is that a good hire? I think both of you are in support of that.
Yeah, Congressman Johnson, of course, has represented that area for years and years. And I think he does represent, as does the new president of Ohio State, to be honest with you, a different kind of hire. Someone, or entities that have essentially been closed societies for decades, it's very difficult to get change from within because they've excluded independent thinking. And if we're going to change and make these universities more efficient, better centers of learning. You don't even have to take money away from it. If you spend the money better, lower tuition, make sure that more students who are Ohio residents can go to Ohio State University, do things like that, those changes are going to have to come from someone who's not part of that sort of closed society, in my opinion.
It's pretty well accepted that in whether it's in higher education or in business, where my background is, that a lot of times needed change comes from outside factors, whether it's responding to competition, whether it's responding to government regulations, et cetera. A lot of times the needed changes that are identified are very difficult to come from within. So having these outsiders, or what I would call non-traditional presidents, starting to come into our systems is going to be a good thing.
Very good. Coming up also as we move into primary season, we have a March primary in Ohio. The actual primary date is March 19th. Early in-person voting starts February 21st, and military and overseas absentee voting already started. That started on February 2nd. Recently, the Attorney General of Ohio, Dave Yost, invalidated the language of yet another constitutional amendment targeting Ohio's vulnerable constitution with a simple majority vote is all that's needed, of course, to change the Constitution. So if you have $61 million, you can enshrine yourself into the Constitution. Anyway, this constitutional amendment ballot initiative would do several things. And Senate President Huffman, one of the things it would do would be automatically register all eligible Ohioans to vote unless they opt out. What could possibly go wrong with that?
Yeah, so, when I think people take a first glance, they look to see this would be an easy solution. Well, there are a whole lot of problems, one of which is there are a lot of people who don't want to register. They don't want to be on the rolls because maybe they don't want to get a bunch of mailers. They don't want to serve on jury duty. They're not participating. There's some religious societies that don't participate in the vote. So people come up with these ideas, and there's a number of other provisions that have been critical. And by the way, with this, I agree with the Cleveland Plain Dealer editorial board who sort of panned this provision. So I think that this is really, along with the redistricting amendment that Maureen O'Connor is putting forth, these are attempts by far left progressive groups, generally controlled by national and international people, to change the law and the makeup of the state of Ohio. This is yet another attempt to try to do that. And so we'll see what happens, but it'll be interesting.
Well, one of the things too, the Plain Dealer actually did put out an editorial regarding showing photo ID, Ohio's new law that you have to have a valid driver's license or a state identification card, which you can get free. But this would repeal that. It would rescind the photo ID requirement for in-person voting and just sign an affidavit that would say, I say that I am who I am. I mean, this seems like, especially when you look at what's happening on our southern border, we don't know who is coming to vote, and this would also allow same-day registration and same-day voting when you register to vote. So this is all about trying to deconstruct Ohio's election security.
Well, we also know from other states, as well as in Ohio, that since voter ID has been required, turnout has actually been rather spectacular. So it's not keeping people from voting. So why repeal it? It's a good thing, and it adds to the security and confidence level that voters have in the election process.
Yeah, and I think, if voting is important, which we all agree it is, it's certainly just as important as, you want to get a check. I had to check into my hotel this morning. I had to show my driver's license to show who I was, or for getting on an airplane, a whole number of other things.
Buying cigarettes from alcohol.
If you don't have a driver's license, the state will supply one to you for free. So it's certainly not burdensome, and even if you get there and you forget your ID, you can vote provisionally and you can come back and give it to them. There's a whole number of ways to do that. So this is really an attempt to say, we want to shove a bunch of people to the polls on the date of the election who are all going to evaporate, and we don't know whether they are or not, but they showed up, they voted, they signed an affidavit. We have to count it.
Last week we had Senator Teresa Gavarone on the program, who did an outstanding job. Maybe she can co-host or host the podcast at some point. But she has sponsored Senate Bill 215 that would outlaw foreign contributions for issue campaigns. She talked a lot about that. Right now you cannot accept foreign contributions for a candidate. To a candidate. And when I say foreign contributions, I mean contributions that actually come from outside of the United States, which is sort of a hard concept to get your head around, because why would that happen? But we know it's happening already.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, that was also widely reported. There's a Swiss businessman who's put $200 million that directly affected the 3 ballot initiatives last year. And, did our best to try to get our message out. But when, you're outspent that heavily, it's hard to do.
And some of that money that was coming from the 1630 fund has gone into the redistricting initiative as well.
Yeah. So that's already happening. And, my message there is, look, we fought for 200 years on redistricting. And then one moment in time, in 2015 and 18, over 70% of Ohioans, both political parties, agreed on a system. And when it was allowed to work in 2023, it was a bipartisan, unanimous vote in favor of the General Assembly map. Now, somebody may be able to figure someplace else in the United States, but where else in the United States in the last several years on a hotly contested political issue have we had unanimous bipartisan support? Anywhere. And that's the system now that Maureen O'Connor wants to attack.
Well, we also know that, for example, in Cuyahoga County, we know what a Republican hotbed that is.
Right.
Yeah, right.
But we also like to say that candidates and campaigns and the issues matter. So if you have a solid candidate who's good on the issues and knows how to get the platform out there, it does make a difference who your candidate is, and you know that all too well.
Absolutely. I mean, and we've seen some pretty lousy candidates in the last number of years, and some of them actually get elected sometimes because of the demographics in their districts. But look, I think the president is exactly right that we have a redistricting system that, as we saw in 23, it works. And I believe it was 76% of the voters approved that ballot initiative to change the system to the one we have now. We should stick with it. It worked, and it's probably unprecedented amongst the states.
Senate Bill 137 would ban ranked choice voting, and Senator Gavarone talked a little bit about how that works, where you cast your ballot, but then you cast your vote for maybe your second choice or your third choice. It's almost like I'm trying to pick what my first, second, and third choice would be at the buffet or at the wedding party on the menu. This sounds like it is very complex and really open to the potential of just getting it wrong. I mean, that maybe the tabulation would be wrong even.
Yeah, it sounds like one of those voting systems somebody comes up with in high school to figure out, all right, everybody vote just for me and don't put a second, third, and fourth choice down or some such thing like that. And there's some logic. If you're sitting around drinking coffee or your favorite adult beverage, and everybody comes up with it, they can see how it works. But then you try to apply that to tens of thousands or hundreds or millions of people who don't know each other, don't quite know how the system works, and you end up with some really bizarre results. And I think a lot of people get frustrated, as certainly I do sometimes, that it's this binary choice. It's either this party or that party. And truth be told, that the majority of voters, and certainly more than either political party, are independent voters. Maybe they usually vote for Republican, but not all. Those are the people really deciding the elections. And people they complain about the two-party system. Well, if you don't want the two-party system, you can have, say, what Israel has, which is 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 parties, and every 8 or 9 months they're disassembling their government and coming up with a new one. And so, yeah, we end up picking a winner and a loser, and they're only in for 2 or 4 years, and if they don't do a good job, the next person gets voted in. But this would just add more uncertainty for the public.
It's almost like there's a concerted effort to try to dilute the electorate, whether it's the new redistricting amendment or ranked choice voting or whatever it may be. There seems to be a well-funded effort to just change the foundation of how Ohio's elections are run and how Ohio's political districts are decided. Do you really, what's your opinion about where that is coming from?
Well, where it's coming from is that for many years in the state of Ohio, like the U.S. Congress, until 1990-ish, I think 48 out of the 50 previous years, Democrats controlled the United States Congress until Newt Gingrich and the contract with America. And that's also when Republicans gained control of both houses in the Ohio General Assembly. and it was their turn to draw the maps. So, and those maps were first drawn in 2001. Well, in 2002 was the first attempt to change redistricting, in 2005, in 2012. And we actually came up with an agreement together in 2015. Well, we're still not electing enough people who will do what we want, so let's try to change it again. That's where it's coming from. The answer is, Ohio is a big state. There's a lot at stake here. There's a lot of money involved. And if they can come in the Constitution and control the government and control the money the way they want to, then that's worth it for them to spend all of that money. And Ohio has changed because a lot of the folks who live here don't vote Democratic anymore. Labor unions, about half of them, have decided Republicans do better for working families than Democrats do. Many Catholics have left the Democrat Party because of the abortion issue. And there are also now, I think, a lot of minorities leaving the Democrat Party because they're the victims of failing inner city schools. So it's changing. The people are voting more Republican. They're voting for people like Donald Trump. So the answer is we need to change the rules. And that's what's happening.
It's actually, on top of that, this is right out of the progressive playbook. And if you can't field good candidates and win elections, you go to court. And we've seen so much of that in the last number of years. And if you're not successful in the courts, then you go to the people through ballot initiatives. And that's what they're seeing. And that was why it was so important. It would have been great for us to have passed the 60% threshold, because what people in Ohio need to understand better, I think, is that the influence of outside of Ohio entities and wealthy individuals, how much influence they have in setting what is going to be law in Ohio, what is going to be in our Constitution, and that is not right. And that's why we all should support limiting outside money coming into issue elections.
Governing by constitutional amendment is a really terrible way to govern.
But it's right out of their playbook, and that's the only option they have at this point.
Well, look at California, how well it's worked for them.
Yes, they're doing
bankrupted
very
the
well.
state and everything else.
Yeah, it's Jerry's right about the 60% thing, and of course that was done in sort of a cauldron of all of the other issues that were going on. And that's why 10 years ago, a bipartisan group voted in a committee, constitutional reorganization committee, to actually do this, both Republicans and Democrats. So perhaps in a more sober moment, we may be able to revisit that.
Before we move on here, I wanted to get back to Senate Bill 83, the Higher Education Enhancement Act. That did pass the Senate. It's in the House. Is there an update on where that stands?
Well, we're at the -11 version, so we've made some modifications.
You've had a few hearings, by the way.
We had quite a few hearings, one as long as over 7.5 hours. But that's fine. I kept the hearings going until the last person gave their input. So we could not be accused of not listening to opposition points of view. So the bill right now, it was passed out of committee in the House back in November, and we're waiting for it to get on the floor. I know that there are more than 50 votes to pass this bill in the House. The Speaker, I met with the Speaker, we talked about the bill, I explained the key components. He told reporters a few hours later that same day that it was a priority bill for him. And so we're waiting for it to be taken to the floor of the House. We're doing everything we can to try to make that happen.
This is also part of the overall reform of not only higher education, but even the foundation of K through 12 education in the state of Ohio, giving parents more options to send their students to a school that's a better fit for them. It's something that we included in the state budget, universal school scholarships on a sliding scale for higher income families as well. How important do you think that this is right now, as this was just passed as part of the budget in 2023, but we've seen really an overwhelming response of people wanting to apply for those scholarships?
Well, I think it's a big piece of a bigger picture. So, we have over 600 school districts. We've got about 1.6 million children in our schools. By far, the largest, of course, are the public schools. When you look at school choice programs, by far the biggest is open enrollment, children going from one public school to another. Now, there are some public schools that and by law don't allow open enrollment. They can choose if they want to. If you look on a map of Ohio, those are generally the public school districts that ring the urban districts. They don't want kids from Columbus coming to Upper Arlington and schools. Upper Arlington's chose not to allow that, and they can do that. Well, what does a child that is in a school that's not servicing their needs for whatever else do? Well, hopefully there's a charter school, or hopefully there's a private school if they can afford to go to that private school. And that's where the Ed Choice voucher or scholarship comes into place, is it allows for a portion of the cost for that child to pay. Now, usually a foundation or the parents or someone else has to make up that cost. The expansion that we did in the most recent budget allows a lot more people to take advantage of that. But there are still a lot of children in Ohio in a variety of circumstances that don't have choice because, one, those scholarships don't pay the full amount. Secondly, there may not be a school for them to go to because there's not one in every neighborhood. And so if you can't open enroll out of the Columbus City schools and there are no schools around, private or charter, for you to go to, then you're stuck with one option.
It's been interesting, though, when you read the narrative from almost every major newspaper or even the national attention that this has received is, look at all the money this is costing the state of Ohio that could be going to public schools. Well, it discounts the fact that in the last budget there was an additional $1 billion put into Ohio's public schools. And doesn't this actually save the state long term?
So in short, these scholarships are about $8,000. The average cost for the entire state for public school student is about $14,000 for the taxpayer. So for every student who's using that one, the taxpayer, now the public school doesn't automatically save $6,000, but from the taxpayer's perspective, if I'm a taxpayer and I can say, I'd like to pay a lesser amount if we can get just as good education, how do we know that? Well, because that's what the parents chose. They're in the best position to know that. And remember also, most of the people who are choosing this are in urban areas where that cost of that education is exponentially higher. It's in the $25,000 to $30,000 range in places like Youngstown, East Cleveland, and other places. So you're really saving almost $20,000 a student for every child who takes the scholarship. So there's two reasons. This is what the parents and the family want for the child, and it saves the taxpayers a lot of money.
I think first of all, the expansion that we did in the budget last year is extremely popular in the district. I've talked with a lot of my constituents, and they are very pleased with what we did. And the other part is that when I talk with superintendents, I remind them that I think the increase was 13.9% or something.
Oh yeah, a lot of money.
Something like that to the public schools. And so we didn't, it wasn't a situation where we took money away from the public schools to do this for private schools. The idea was what's best for the students and their families, and how could we give them better choice. We have some school systems around the state, Cleveland is one of them, that the cost per student is probably the highest in the state right now, and they're the least performing. And so we have to give students options. Education is the best ticket out of poverty or to improve your economic situation. We have to make sure everybody has access to it and has choice.
And to a qualified workforce to bring in major investment for
Absolutely.
Whether it's Intel or whatever it may be. You want to make sure that the students are educated and have the foundation of an education, so when they go on to higher ed, that they're prepared and qualified for these higher paying jobs.
Yeah, education is the key to a better job and financial freedom. And we can say that, we have freedoms in this country, freedom of speech and all of the other things, but you're not really free until you are financially free. You're in control of your own destiny. You're not dependent on the government or your parents or whoever else. It's your money, and you get to do what you want with it. And that all starts with a basic education.
Ohio Senate President Matt Huffman, State Senator Jerry Cirino. Gentlemen, thanks for your time today.
Thank you, John.
Appreciate
Thanks, John.
it. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you soon.